quick introductions. So my name is Vanessa and I am the Tiny Forest project manager. And I'm also here tonight with my colleague Beth, who I will introduce yourself.
Yep, hi, I'm Beth Puddyfoot. So I'm the research assistant for Tiny Forests. So I am in the science part of the Tiny Forest team. So I work very closely with Vanessa, helping to implement all of our Tiny Forests and also setting up the monitoring and collection of data associated with our Tiny Forests after they've been planted, which we'll talk a little bit more about during the talk.
Wonderful, thank you. And as I was saying to Helen a little bit earlier on, this is a really exciting presentation, particularly because the Frome Tiny Forest is all signed and ready to go, hoping to plant either late November or early December. So yes, feel free to ask any questions and hopefully get lots of positive responses and look to get some community engagement from you guys in advance of the planting, during planting, and also for a few years afterwards as well. So we'll start the presentation then. So just a quick overview as to kind of who Earthwatch are. So we are an environmental charity, and we are kind of a global charity NGO. And last year we were also awarded IPO status. So we are also a IRO status, sorry, an independent research organisation as well. So really key focusing on the science part of all of our projects. And we have offices all over the world, but our office is based in Oxford and we are Earthwatch Europe. So we kind of focus on 5 different areas, and they are sustainable agriculture, some innovation projects with the EU, education, fresh water, and links to Tiny Forest is our Climate Proof Cities programme. And Tiny Forest is kind of our flagship project within that. A quick intro to Tiny Forest then, and a little bit on what we'll be talking about in this evening's discussion. So I'll quickly cover what Tiny Forest is and the history behind it and how we've come to this stage. What a tiny forest is, and then the steps taken to create a tiny forest, starting right from the initial site visit all the way through to planting day, and then what happens beyond that. And then we'll also cover a little bit on the citizen science monitoring of the forests and the future plans for the project as a whole. So tiny forests then, they are dense, very densely packed native woodlands that are about the size of a tennis court, so it's approximately 200 meters squared. And they're a real oasis for plants, insects, birds, small mammals, and they really support the well-being of the local communities and schools who use them too. The tree planting is based on a specific planting technique developed by a Japanese botanist called Dr. Miyawaki. And this was back in the 1970s. And it's a methodology that really encourages accelerated forest development. So taking a process that should take hundreds of years and speeding it up to happen within a matter of 5–10 years. And to do this, Earthwatch is working in partnership with a Dutch organisation called IVN. And then finally, kind of a key point is that these forests really serve as inspiring places for outdoor learning and also act as a social point for local residents and local community groups who help plant them and also help to maintain them in their first few years. And with these community volunteers, we will also engage them in the scientific monitoring to better understand the benefits that these tiny forests provide in our urban spaces. A little bit on the history then. So the whole concept of these miniature Miyawaki forests started back in the 1970s with Professor Miyawaki. And he is the founder of what's called the Miyawaki method, which is the forest method that this particular style of planting is based on. And back in the 1970s, Miyawaki really wanted to restore ecologically sound native forests all across Japan, and kind of changed their function so that they acted as both disaster prevention and also environmental preservation forests, particularly in urban areas. So usually, as I said earlier, these forests would take several hundred years to fully establish, but with this particular method, it skips over some of the natural forest succession steps, which means that you can then establish a forest in a much shorter time frame. And this was something that a man called Shubhendu Sharma was really taken by, and he heard about this kind of methodology in 2011. And following on from this, he really took a real passion and interest in it and founded the company called Afforest, which was committed to reforestation both in India and also beyond. And he kind of was the person that took this Miyawaki method and took it to the next step kind of in the evolution of the Tiny Forest Project, and refining it, making it something that was more replicable as a product. So he specifically focused on cities, and also had a key aim of increasing biodiversity in these hubs of nature as well. And since Afforest was established, they've managed to plant over 135 of these Miyawaki forests across 10 countries, which is really fantastic. And then in 2015, so 4 years later, it was then time for this methodology to kind of make its way to Europe. So a guy called Dan from the Netherlands created an organization called IVN, and this stands for the Institute for Nature Conservation Education. And he is now IVN's Chief Tree Planting Officer. So kind of the next stage of this evolution of this methodology was that IVN really wanted to pioneer the engagement aspect. So taking this methodology and its environmental benefits, but really keen to engage school children in planting them, which then gave these school children the opportunity to watch these forests grow and develop as they too grew over their school years. And it gave the opportunity to learn about them and really interact with them and kind of just watch it develop over time. So this was the point that the actual name Tiny Forests was conceived. And then finally, back in 2019, Earthwatch got in touch with Dan from IVN, and we've since received full hands-on training from them, as well as their Dutch landscapers coming over to the UK to really help us deliver our first tiny forest back in Whitby last year. And we're really closely linked with them now. They provide us with a lot of coaching, and we work really closely with them going forward. But Earthwatch is now the UK's lead delivery partner in the UK. So key characteristics of what a tiny forest is, it's 600 bare root tree saplings planted in this tennis court plot, which really maximizes the benefits per metre squared of land. This is obviously hugely different to traditional tree planting methodologies, but because we focus the implementation of these tiny forests in really urban areas, often the land there is really limited. So this gives us the opportunity to bring this hub of nature to the people living there, even if there's only small plots of land available. As mentioned earlier, it really encourages accelerated growth, and we also don't use any chemicals or fertilizers. It's a really low management and maintenance methodology. So we will speak a little bit later about the keeper team, and they're kind of really involved in the first couple of years. But after that, the forest is really left to fully establish itself. These also create a really rich hub of biodiversity, and some of the other tiny forests in the Netherlands that are far more established than ours here in the UK have attracted hundreds of different animal and plant species within the first 3 years, which is going to be really nice to see and also monitor as part of our engagement days. And then finally, they are a really accessible green space, and quite often, which you can, it's actually hidden in this photo because the trees are in the way, but we quite often like to include an outdoor classroom area, which is an opportunity for local residents and also school children to be able to reconnect with nature and spend time in them as well. So Earthwatch just really wants to focus on the engagement aspect, obviously, as well as the environmental aspect as well. So I think now I'm going to hand over to Beth, who's going to take you through the different stages of how a tiny forest is created.
Lovely, thank you, Vanessa. So yeah, hopefully now you have a good overview of what a tiny forest is and kind of our aims and what we hope to achieve by bringing a tiny forest to a local community. So I'm just going to run you through our kind of step-by-step process as to how we get there. So once we have a proposed site for a tiny forest, so you guys in Frome, there has been a site proposed, so all of these steps will be coming your way very soon, hopefully over summer, so that we're ready for planting in autumn. Once we've got the site set upon, we will go and visit the site and do a site visit. And this is really important for us to understand more about the characteristics of the site, identify any potential constraints that might exist, so things like utilities and infrastructure, existing trees and things like public rights of way, and look at some of the logistical aspects of the site as well. It's also an opportunity for us to meet with the landowner and possibly future users of the forest and kind of understand what they want to get out of the forest as well, and kind of discuss some of their desires for the tiny forest. Probably the most important part of this site visit is that when we're on site, we'll conduct a soil survey. So this is to assess the type of soil present and its characteristics, so that we know things such as the soil compaction, the texture, the pH, and we'll measure this in multiple locations within where the tiny forest will be placed. And the reason we do this soil assessment is to really make sure we're planting the correct trees, so the right trees in the right place. And so to do that, we need to know what the soil conditions are to direct our tree species choice. Also, because we're often planting in urban areas or built up areas, there can be unexpected things below ground. It might look like a nice piece of green amenity grassland, but there might be some unexpected things lurking beneath the surface that aren't flagged up on maps or plans of the area for some reason. And so by testing in lots of multiple places and testing down to a metre deep, we can see better what's going on below ground. Next slide, please, Vanessa.
Yes, I'm just going to chip in with a question here. Charlotte's just asked, will the trees all be British native? And the answer is yes.
You beat me to it, Charlotte. That's my next point. So yeah, I'll explain a bit now about how we choose our species list. So having done our site survey, we know what the ground conditions are like, so we can start to plan what trees we're going to plant. And as Vanessa said earlier, we'll plant 600 trees, and these will be a mix of lots of different species. So two main bits of information feed into this process. So firstly, the soil survey that we've just done, looking at the soil conditions on site, we choose tree species that are appropriate for these. And then the second piece of information we use is we look at what we call a reference forest. So we identify an existing ancient semi-natural woodland, preferably in close proximity to where the tiny forest site will be, and a forest that has similar soil conditions, topography and elevation. And then we'll explore what tree species and also what woodland communities are growing here, and kind of what ratios different tree species exist in. And so this gives us a good idea of what could survive and what could thrive as a natural woodland in the region. And so then we use this as a guide for our species selection. not only which species to plant, but how many of each species to plant. So determining things such as which will be the dominant species and which are maybe more rarer species in terms of their abundance. Then in addition, we ensure that all of the trees are native to the UK, and we want to have a diverse forest as possible. So we normally end up with around about 20 species per forest, but this varies slightly. And we want these species to be made up of representatives from all of the forest layers. So we're planting shrub species and understory species, but also larger canopy and sub-canopy. And so this means we should have a really good, diverse, heterogenic mix that makes a multi-stratal forest, making use of all of that vertical space and creating lots of different niches for things like biodiversity, but also spreading the use of resources within that plot as well. Next, thank you, Vanessa. Then comes the keeper team. So for each forest, we have what we call a keeper team, and this is a group of around 4 or 5 volunteers. It could be more in some cases or perhaps less, and these are usually representatives of partners of the tiny forest. So it might include people from a local school, members of local community groups, local residents, someone from the local council or a business that's associated with the tiny forest. And these individuals invest a bit more time into the tiny forest, but they really take ownership of the forest and are involved throughout the whole creation of the tiny forest process. And it's a really great opportunity for these individuals to have a closer connection and an interaction with the forest. And they're really ambassadors for the tiny forest. And obviously, as we're planting more tiny forests around the whole of the UK, we've got 16 in the ground now. There's a real kind of community of keeper teams all across the country, which is really lovely. Next slide, please, Vanessa. So then we come to designing the tiny forest. And although it's small, there is an opportunity here to be really creative, and it can be a collaborative process with those who are partnering with the forest and maybe the school or the keeper team to make sure that those local stakeholders have the things that they would like in their tiny forest so that it's usable for them. Some things we have to bear in mind is we try to make sure that the forest is at least 200 meters squared, and it has a minimum width just to make sure we are maintaining the planting density that we want and make sure that it has these forest characteristics. So the forest is usually fenced, and this is to protect the young trees, but we always have a gate so that the forest is accessible to people. In some cases, we include a classroom or learning area. So this is often a kind of alcove area, as you can see in some of those pictures on the left there, which is open but sort of surrounded by the forest and has some benches in. So people can use the forest and enjoy it and feel a bit more immersed and surrounded by the trees. And finally, sometimes there's the option to include a pathway as well. So although the forest is small, a pathway could give you the opportunity to really feel like you're getting into the center of the forest and walk from one side to the other of it. So the drawings on the left are some of the tiny forest designs we have done this year. And the ones on the right are some pictures from India where you can see the forests laid out when they're first planted and then several years later as they've grown into these designs. Next, please, Vanessa. Thank you. So now we know what's at the site, we've created our tree species list, we've set up our keeper team, and we've got a design for the forest, so we're pretty much ready to go. And before we can plant, one of the defining kind of characteristics of the Miyawaki method, and that is really quite important for the success of the tiny forest, is soil preparation. So again, this is quite different to traditional planting methods, but it's something that helps us to ensure that all of these trees, these 600 trees that are planted quite densely, are able to survive in this small space. So the three main reasons for soil preparation is, firstly, primarily to reduce compaction of the soil. So as we've said, we're planting in predominantly urban areas where often soils are really compacted. And in fact, if soils are more compact than 2.5 to 3 megapascals, then tree root growth isn't possible. And so, because we're planting a lot of trees, we need to make sure there's enough space for the tree's roots to establish. The second reason is to make sure there is sufficient nutrient for the trees. So we want to make sure there's enough growing medium for the trees and they can find the resources they need within the soil. And the third point is we do soil preparation to improve the water holding capacity of the soil. So this is again optimizing the amount of water that the soil supporting the tiny forest can hold. And so we try to achieve these three things, firstly by excavating the site. So we actually dig down to 1 meter depth and replace that soil. So we keep all of that soil, but it's been turned over and decompacted, and that's the main point for that step. And as we add this soil back in, we add some soil supplements as we go. And these have been determined based on the soil survey that we've done during our site visit. So we know what kind of soil we have and what things we might need to add. So this is things like organic compost, perhaps some dried manure, or even something like chopped straw if there's big aggregates and the soil is really clayey, to help break that up and decompact it as well. But as Vanessa said earlier, we never use chemical fertilizers, and where we can, we try and source these things from as locally as possible. And I think it's back to you now, Vanessa.
I get to talk about the fun one. So this is obviously the most exciting part is the planting day. In normal times, this would, be a huge community day, and these pictures here are from our Witney Tiny Forest, which we were fortunate enough to plant just before lockdown. So we were able to have lots of volunteers of all ages. We had volunteers from the local school, we had teachers, residents, grandparents. So it was a really, really lovely community day. And we will always plant between late November and early March to follow the planting season. And these three photos kind of take you through how a planting day would run. And of course, because the tiny forest in Frome is going to be planted very late this year, hopefully by then we will be able to have a community day that resembles the one here. So picture one kind of shows what the forest will look like when you first go there at the beginning of planting day. So you'll see, obviously, the ground prep has all been done. The mulch layers all around the outside ready to be placed on the forest once it's been planted. And particularly following on from what Beth has said about the compaction and the reason behind why we do the soil preparation. When we're planting, it's really important to remember that we're trying to compact the soil as little as possible. Obviously, you have to be on the soil to plant, but we don't encourage compressing the soil down with your foot or your heel, and just being conscious, if you're planting one side to the other, walking around the forest, for example, rather than walking over it. Picture two then, in terms of actually putting the trees in the ground. So the methodology states that it's a very random layout of species, and we would never want the same species next to each other or in rows or patterns. So we ensure that we have a really random mix which replicates a natural forest as much as possible. Given the 200 meter squared, we stipulate that it's a 30 centimeter gap between each sapling. And specifically when we're working with children, it's quite easy just to have a ruler with us so they can clearly see how far the different saplings are from each other. And then picture 3, that's the mulching. So once all of the 600 saplings are in the ground, we then use, more commonly we use straw. We have used dead leaves in a few sites, once again, depending on the soil type. And yeah, at the end of the day, we will put approximately a 15 centimeter layer of this mulch over the top. And this is for 4 main reasons. Mostly it's just to protect the soil and the organisms against the direct sunlight. It's also really important to suppress the weeds as much as possible. So therefore there are more nutrients and also there's less competition for the saplings. The mulch also protects the soil from drying out in extreme weather. So both in the summer and also in really harsh winters, it almost creates kind of an insulation layer. And finally, as this mulch slowly decomposes, that again will turn into more nutrients for the younger trees to absorb. So yes, that photo on the right is essentially what your forest will look like at the end of planting day. And this next slide then shows kind of a year life cycle of a forest. So as I mentioned earlier, this Wheatley Tiny Forest was planted back in March 2020. And we planted this forest in collaboration with Wheatley Town Council and also a really fantastic community group that they had there who had previously done some tree planting and were really key in not only the planting day, but also they became part of our keep team afterwards. The forest had quite a tough start. So obviously, immediately after planting this, we went into a lockdown, which meant we were unable to visit it as much as we would like. And it was also, in terms of weather, planted at the end of a very, very wet few months. So the ground, it was really, really muddy. And then almost immediately after planting, the weather totally switched and we actually saw no rain at all for about the first 7 or 8 weeks after planting. So this is kind of a really important point as to why our keeper teams are so important. Because they're locally based, they really act as our eyes on the ground and were able to send us lots of photos and regular updates about the status of the forest. And then since it's been planted, you'll see here that kind of how it's looked through the different seasons and just how much it's grown, I suppose. So obviously in spring, the pictures there begin to show a few leaves. And then in summer, which was only 5 or so months after planting, the saplings have grown hugely. And I think it's kind of particularly noteworthy that we only plant bare root saplings approximately 40 to 60 centimeters, some are 80 centimeters. You can see in that photo that they were already well above the 1 meter chestnut fencing that we had around the edge, which was really lovely to see. And then autumn colours happened, and then we got sent some lovely photos of the forest in the snow. So I will just hand back to Beth now to talk to you a little bit more about the monitoring.
Yeah, thank you. So as Vanessa explained earlier on, one of Earthwatch's kind of key goals is, and kind of our step in involving the tiny forest kind of concept, is to further enhance the engagement aspects of people with the tiny forest. And so we're doing that through citizen science monitoring. So this is the collection or analysis of data by members of the general public. And Earthwatch has a long history of using citizen science across a whole range of projects, and it's part of our mission and the core of our organisation. So in terms of the tiny forest, generally those partners of the tiny forest, so local residents, the local community, a local school, don't only have the opportunity to be involved in the planting day, but also later on to be involved in this monitoring and research associated with the tiny forest. And this is to better understand kind of the dynamic nature of the tiny forests and also help to quantify the benefits that they are providing. Next slide, please. So we will monitor kind of 5 aspects of the tiny forest. So the first 4 are those you can see on the screen now, and they're kind of environmental benefits. And in particular, we want to look at how the forest changes over time, and also how different tiny forests differ from one another. So from a science perspective, this is a really great setup. We create all of our tiny forests by the same or a very similar method, and they're all very similar sized. So it's kind of like a giant science experiment where we have all of these kind of outdoor labs all over the country. And so it's a really great way to then involve citizen scientists to help us monitor them. And then we've got a really nice big data set to do some analysis on. So the first thing that one of the things that we will monitor is thermal comfort. So this is looking at the cooling benefits of trees. So we'll collect data on the temperature difference between inside the forest and the surrounding area, and even compare this to features of the built environment. So how hot it is maybe next to a building wall or a pavement, as opposed to being in the center of the forest. And there's a lot of literature already existing on how urban forests and even standalone urban trees can have really large localized temperature differences. And this is through their active transpiration of water, and also, of course, their canopy and their branches creating a shading effect.
Oh gosh, sorry.
That one, please.
Carry on.
We'll also look at flood management. So this is assessing the forest's ability to store water. And we do this by looking at some of the different soil characteristics. So obviously we've done a lot of soil preparation, but this will also continue to change as the soil, organisms and fauna develop over time, and as the trees themselves grow. So we'll look at things like the texture, the color of the soil, the moisture and compaction. And we'll also look at the infiltration rate, so how quickly water soaks into the soil. And so trees, again, really help in all parts of the hydrological cycle. And so we'd really like to understand kind of just how much a tiny forest can deliver in terms of this flood mitigation potential. We'll also look at biodiversity, which is maybe one of the most fun things we can look at. So although a tiny forest is tiny and is a small green space, when you look at the whole urban green network, it can serve as a really important connector or stepping stone and link other existing habitats. So we hope, and it has been shown in the Netherlands already, that tiny forests are a really valuable ecosystem for lots of different types of biodiversity. So when we monitor the forest, we'll conduct different species surveys, so looking at the pollinators and butterflies using the forest, and also things like soil dwelling organisms as well, so what the soil fauna is looking like as well. Carbon capture is maybe one of the most obvious things that people think about when they think about trees or forests. And so to have an estimation of the carbon capture of our tiny forests, we'll measure the above ground biomass. So this is looking at things like tree height and stem diameter. And then you can do a calculation to have an estimate of how much carbon the forest is sequestering and kind of locking away as tree biomass. And then the fifth thing, which isn't on this slide and is slightly separate to those environmental features of the forest, is well-being. So obviously part of the forest and the Tiny Forest project is engaging people in the project. And so we'll conduct social surveys as well with local residents and volunteers, and seeing how tiny forests are enabling people to connect with nature in their local area, see how it's supporting their general well-being through things like its aesthetic value and being a nice place to go and visit, to do things like watching wildlife, or at a more involved sense, how people's well-being is affected by having personal involvement in the project too.
Thank you. So just kind of before we come to a close then, a couple of ideas and aims that we have for the project over the next few years. So our big aim is to have created and established 150 tiny forests throughout the UK by 2023. And through that, we're hoping that that's going to directly benefit 35,000 people, whether that be school children, residents, corporates, community groups, anything like that. And also following on from these plantings, hopefully run about 450 citizen science monitoring events. And linked to what Beth has just said about well-being and also the education piece here, is that I know a lady in the chat mentioned that she was doing her forest school training. So we also have a whole host of free online education resources that have been created for children for Key Stage 1, 2 and 3. And we've kind of got teachers packs, pupil packs, which really offer lesson ideas, activity ideas, all to do with general environmental themes as a whole, and also ideas specifically to incorporate the tiny forest, and even some activities to run in the forest and in the outdoor classroom area itself. So as we start to kind of get planning on this, and when it eventually gets in the ground, we will be sending that link to anyone who would like access to it. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So thank you all for listening. I guess we will just open the floor for any questions.
So there's one from Amelia in the chat saying, the trees seem to be planted very close together. Do they need thinning at any stage? So I can answer that one. So yes, we plant at a density that is 3 trees per metre squared, which is very close together. And this is part of the reason why we see this accelerated growth rate, because there's a level of competition that's driving the trees to reach for light, and so competing with one another. We, in terms of our management and maintenance of the tiny forest, as Vanessa explained, we want and we try to make sure that our forests are low maintenance, and so we don't thin them. So after kind of the first 2 years, we would expect the canopy to be closed, and then we sort of let natural processes take course. So there's inevitably going to be some mortality within the forest, and those trees that do die, they'll be left within the forest to then decompose naturally and be recycled into the soil and be part of that whole forest ecosystem. Hopefully that answers it.
I don't have any more questions in the chat. If anyone is feeling brave enough, feel free to just ask.
You can, yeah.
Yep. No, go for it.
So if anyone that's attending this evening wants to be part of the Keeper team or interested in that, please do get in touch with me at the council. That's Helen Viner. I'm the Wild About Trees Projects Officer. So I'd love to hear from you. All right, fantastic.
Yes, that'd be great. And I can also send through, for anyone who is interested in being part of the Keeper team, a one-page PDF document that will kind of outline a little bit what Beth has said, and a few further details on exactly the type of activities that a Keeper team would be involved in for more information. We've had 2 more questions. So is the site kept locked for security or available 24/7? And there is a need to support a website called Make Space for Girls, and the benches in the classroom space look ideal. So in terms of locking, the site is not locked, but there is a gate. So this season, we have tended to use chestnut paling fencing, which you'll have seen in the photos. And we are kind of discussing internally if we continue to use that, or maybe we move to metal fencing. It's an ongoing discussion, but there will always be a pedestrian access gate into the classroom area. And even if there wasn't a classroom area, there would still be one because of the monitoring of the forest. But yes, it's not locked, and great that the benches and classroom space look really good. We've tried to choose benches that are relatively low to the ground, specifically so that children can also sit there and feel comfortable as well as the adults. Charlotte has said, could I join you right at the beginning when you take the soil survey? I will hand that over to Beth because she's actually going for her soil survey next week.
Yes, hopefully I am due to go next Monday to site and do the soil survey. So I'm sure Charlotte's, so long I've got to meet a few other people on site. So as long as COVID rules are adhered to, I'm sure there's no problem with that. You're welcome to join and kind of have a look and see how we do things.
So do you want to email me at the council? So as long as we keep our rule of 6, I just need to make sure that we don't go above the rule of 6 for that. So if you can email me, you can come meet us down there, but I just need to make sure that we're doing things safely and appropriately. So yeah, email me at the council, Charlotte, and I'll be in touch before next week. If you can do that tomorrow, because I don't work Thursday and Friday, that'll be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question saying, is there not a risk that dominant species will result in a loss of other species and impact on biodiversity?
That's a really good question, John. Thank you. I suppose, yes, there is always the chance that dominant species will do particularly well and take up a lot of space in the tiny forest. Hopefully, going through all the steps we have in choosing our tree species, we have chosen tree communities that do survive well together. So that's kind of the point of using things like our reference forest, where we look at which species are naturally dominant and which species are naturally rare in those communities and so can survive alongside them. And therefore, hopefully, we don't have this case too much, but it is a natural forest. We will let those natural processes take course. And again, that's an important reason for monitoring the forest. So in particular with the things like the carbon capture, our methodology means that we'll tag 100 of those trees, and those trees we will continually come back and measure and monitor, not only in terms of things like how much they're growing, but also in terms of things like mortality. So then that'll give us a better idea of if there's a species that's doing particularly well or particularly badly, and see whether there's patterns across different forests and what that link might be. And so that's all part of the process of learning more about our forests.
Thank you. Question saying, can wildlife like foxes get in and out? So the chestnut paling fencing that we've used this season tends to have a gap of about, let's say, 5 centimeters between each stake. So for example, foxes wouldn't be able to get through that. Part of the site assessment that we carry out is not only to take samples of the soil, but also just to assess the area in general. And we'll specifically look for and ask questions about any local wildlife that tend to frequent that area. So for example, if specific areas, there are maybe community concerns with rabbits, for example, we can look into adding additional rabbit fencing at the bottom of the standard fencing and on the other end of the scale, if there are concerns, for example, around deer, and we can look to add specific fencing around that. So it's very much, hopefully when Beth goes next week, very much just about what each site has specifically, and then we can look to tailor the fencing to any wildlife concerns. A question that says, how old is the oldest tiny forest and what do they look like when they are mature? Can I hand that one to you?
Yeah. So as Vanessa had described, the kind of evolution of the tiny forest from the Miyawaki method, the oldest tiny forest in the sense that has been planted by this Miyawaki method, which is the dense planting, basing your species selection from naturally existing forests and the soil preparation steps. In Japan, I believe some of their forests are around 40 years old, and they have done extremely well. They have turned into fully grown forests and are very dense, perhaps more applicable to our geographical location is in the Netherlands. So they planted their first tiny forest in 2015. So I think this is its 6th growing season now. So I'm sure we can share some pictures of what that looks like. And it's really quite astonishing just how big and how full the forest looks. And so I'm sure we can share some of those pictures afterwards.
Yes, that's no problem. I will. Anyone who's interested, I can send them the Keeper Team PDF and also some pictures of the Dutch forests as well. We've also had a question that says, how long does Earthwatch intend to oversee the citizen science work post-planting? Your programme is ambitious and I'm wondering how you'll cope. Great question. Just before I hand this one to Beth, this forest is being funded by the DEFRA grant. And kind of the conditions of the funding were that we have to spend the grant by March 2022. So for this location, we'll be planting November/December, and then we will be running our monitoring event at some time in March. And there, from a funds point of view, we are currently seeking more funds from a range of organisations in order to continue monitoring that. Did you have anything to add to that, Beth?
Yeah, just that I suppose part of the way that we have set up the monitoring is to make it as intuitive as possible. So hopefully, in some cases, after Earthwatch has perhaps led some of these monitoring events, people who've participated in them feel confident that they could perhaps go and redo some of those surveys, and we are currently in the process of building a online data platform. So all of the kind of input of data and the instructions for how you do the surveys will be online, and so a lot more accessible as well, hopefully. And alongside, kind of parallel to the citizen science part that we're doing, we are also taking on master's students and looking at other research-based grants to kind of do more in-depth, detailed research that will complement the data that we collect from citizen scientists as well.
Thank you.
I've got one question, sorry.
Oh, yes.
Does the fencing around it, does that eventually come down after a number of years?
Yes. So is it after the first few years, Beth?
Yeah, so after the first 2 or 3. So essentially, the fence is to kind of protect the trees while they're young and a bit more vulnerable. So from things like perhaps dogs and
Footballs.
And balls that could trample and squash some of the young saplings. But hopefully after the first couple of years, the trees are established enough that they don't need that extra protection. I guess if you wanted to keep the fence, then there's no problem with that either.
We've had another question that says, any cost figures you can share on the ground preparation work? This is very much off the top of my head, but I think approximately, including the soil preparation and all of the materials for the forest, so kind of the trees, the benches, the fencing, all of the physical side, is approximately 10,000. But I would need to double check that. But if you would like to know more about that, I can share that with you afterwards. That is it at the moment on the questions. Does anyone have anything else? If not, of course, our emails are there, so you're more than welcome to send through any questions directly to us after tonight as well.
I'd just like to say thanks so much, Vanessa and Beth, for coming to do the presentation. Really informative, and really looking forward to the project and working with you.